Hey, a video here about preservation efforts from humans. So this is kind of continue on from the last topic of the sixth extinction and, things are dying out. Well, here's a little bit of like what humans are doing or what's being done in order to preserve some of the species that are at risk. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit more about kind of how human activity is bad and negative before we get into the preservation stuff. So human activity can lead to a lack of genetic variation. And what you learned is that when we have less genetic diversity, then that means that species are less able to adapt to changes. So if I have less diversity, then when a change comes along, I don't have things that are necessarily adapted to that change because they're all basically identical, right? So when I have low genetic diversity, that means that all of the organisms in that population are very, very similar. And so human activity leads to a loss in this genetic diversity or genetic variation. A great example is when we have overhunting and overfishing. We reduce the numbers of those populations by a huge amount. And then as a result, as we have less populations that can actually breed and less gene pools that can mix, as a result, I end up losing more and more genetic diversity. So reduced populations means there are fewer breeding pairs. With fewer breeding pairs, genetic variation or genetic diversity ends up decreasing or shrinking. So I thought this was kind of a really interesting graph for you to take a look at of how fishing has changed over the years. So this goes all the way from 1950s into the 2000s and tracks for different fish species or stocks, how much of them are underexploited. So that means that they're still actually growing in population as time goes on. Fully exploited, which means that as much is being fished as are being produced, so population is staying relatively stable. Overexploited or overfished means that more fish are being caught and captured in fishing than are actually breeding, so the population over time has gone down. And then when we talk about crashed stocks, I'm going to assume that that means that essentially the writing is on the wall and things are going downhill for whatever is left of that species at that time. So it's no longer at a level where it's going to be able to probably survive as it stands right now if things continue. So that would be the crashed category. So as time went on, you can see that at the beginning, 85% of things were actually sustainably fished. They were underexploited. So that means that more fish were actually being produced, by breeding and so on, than were being fished. 15% were harvested to their maximum sustainable limits. So that means it was at a point where, the population was staying steady even with the fishing. Well, you can see how different the story is now, right? Or even years from now, because this was actually kind of early 2000s by looking at the scale of this graph. So 32% of stocks had collapsed at that time in 2003. 39% were overfished, so it's not sustainable. Essentially what that means is that more fish are being caught and captured than are being born, and population is decreasing. And the remaining 29% are at the limits of sustainability. So they're being fully exploited. So it's still, the population is staying relatively constant, but it's not underexploited. So anyways, I think it's telling. I think it's interesting to look at this graph and how it's changed over time, and a little bit scary, right? Okay. So loss of genetic variation can occur just naturally. We're not necessarily responsible for it in every case. A great example is cheetahs. Cheetahs are a threatened species native to Africa and Asia. And these cats actually have very little genetic variation, and that's due to the last ice age, cheetahs going through a long period of inbreeding. So essentially there weren't many left, and as a result, they were breeding with each other when they were fairly close relatives. And because of this, there's not a lot of genetic variation within cheetahs. So all cheetahs are actually very, very similar in their genetic code, which is a problem because with that low genetic diversity, right, you're not getting any adaptations. You're not getting changes in offspring that will enable it to survive in changing conditions. So they cannot adapt to changes in the environment as quickly as other animals, and fewer cheetahs survive to maturity. Cheetahs are also much more difficult to breed in captivity than other big cats such as lions. So cheetahs very much in trouble, and that's a lot of it to do with the low genetic diversity, right? So all the cheetahs are very, very similar gene-wise, and then also the difficulty in mating in captivity. So writing's probably on the wall for the cheetahs. Zoos can actually help prevent extinction by doing a few things. And zoos can be somewhat controversial, but what zoos do that is fantastic is they provide education to people of all ages. We've gone to the Calgary Zoo, Crescent Heights, quite a few different times to see their programs and see the animals, and it's always been a great experience. Really, really good going to the zoo. So yes, provides education to people of all ages, exchanging animals between zoos for breeding to maintain genetic diversity. That's an important thing. So if you have this small population in the zoo of, an animal and they're just inbreeding in that small population, you're going to have very, very low genetic diversity. So instead what they do is they do exchange programs where they'll take like a mating male, for example, and move it between zoos, right? And that enables the gene pool to get deeper. We have more genetic diversity then within that population by introducing new species. And then they also help protect and preserve endangered animals, right? So at the zoo, you'll actually have endangered animals that are there that are being protected and preserved by not being in the wild. Seed banks are kind of like zoos for seeds. So these are actually places where seeds are kept in conditions where they can last for an incredibly long time. And they're storing and gathering seeds from plants that are at risk of becoming extinct. So if a plant does become extinct, well, then we have seeds and we could technically grow it again. Seed banks could be run by companies, governments, or universities. The reason why there's possibly profit in this is, well, there could be seeds or plants that actually have very, very useful properties, right? That have chemicals inside of them that could be used for things like pharmaceuticals. So as a result, it's something that a company might care to do and put some money into because it's worth preserving these plants for the possible uses they may have later on. Poaching is another global issue that things are being done about. So poaching is a problem where, basically animals are killed or hurt in order to get products from them. So what you're seeing there, I believe, is a white rhino, maybe not, but a rhino to be sure, some kind of rhinoceros, and their horn has obviously been removed, which is a problem for poaching. Rhinoceros horn is kind of a hot commodity that can sell for quite a bit of money in certain parts of the world. So as a result, rhino poaching is a big problem, and it's part of the reason why they are somewhat endangered. I think they're endangered. Anyways, the 1975 Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, called, normally I think people say CITES for this, CITES, prevents endangered animals or plants or even parts of these organisms from being either exported or imported. So this is international trade law. That means that we can't actually, it's not possible for these kind of products to be sold or bought. It is a law that makes it illegal to buy or sell either full or parts of endangered animals. So that's being done to prevent poaching. If you take away the market for something, right, like rhino horns, then as a result, you're not going to have as many poachers because there's just simply no money in it. There's also organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund that's doing things to help with preservation. So the Canadian Wildlife Federation and Canadian Nature Foundation educate the people and bring issues about biodiversity to the attention of the government. So that's another group that does some stuff in order to try to help. So there's different federations. You've probably seen different organizations that actually do this kind of work and basically try to educate people, bring awareness to the issue. Maybe they are in contact and try to put some pressure on government around these issues in order to change things. So stuff is certainly being done. Okay, so that is it for this, and actually that is the end of the whole unit. What's important from this particular lesson is really that you understand the idea of overhunting and overfishing causing problems with genetic diversity, which then makes it really difficult for a certain species to repopulate and get that genetic diversity back. Hopefully you learned about things like zoos and seed banks, that essentially these are places that give protection to animals so they can be kept safe and they're no longer in the wild. That you learned about things about zoos in terms of educating, that they have exchange programs for mating with different organisms, that sort of thing. What else? You should know about cities, that is trying to stop poaching by removing the market so that you can no longer buy or sell endangered animals, plants, or parts of endangered animals or plants. And that there's different foundations, federations like the World Wildlife Federation that's doing things in order to make things better, to hopefully protect animals that are endangered and so on. Okay, well, anyways, that is it. Have a good rest of your day.